Welcome all of you to this 35th webinar in the discussion series on tipping elements, the notion of irreversibly and abrupt changes in the Earth system. I'm Christopher Ryer. I will be moderating the webinar today. I work at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in a group called Forest Ecosystem Resilience. So we are heavily interested in this topic, and I'm very delighted that we have two exciting speakers today, and I will introduce them in a second. First, about this discussion series, it's really designed to advance the knowledge on tipping elements and support efforts to increase the consistency and treatment tipping elements in the scientific community, develop a joint research agenda and experiments, and of course, gather ideas for a so-called TipMIP, tipping point modeling intercomparison project. The network is organized by the Earth Commission, the AIMS project, which are both Earth Commission and AIMS hosted by Future Earth, and also the Safe Landing Climate's Lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program. Yeah, this specific event now is, or this series is organized by the YASA and PIC together with the University of Exeter. It's very good to see that so many of you are here. So we are at 70 participants and more are joining every second. So that's really nice. Just as we are in a webinar setting, please remember the Zoom or general house rules here. So we are in a webinar mode, so you can ask questions in this Q&A panel that you see on your screen. We only will react to questions that come through this Q&A panel because you can downvote and upvote questions and we can group them. So it's a bit better than through the chat. So please don't use the chat function to post your questions, but really use the Q&A of the Zoom software. And yeah, please, it's also recorded. So the recording is already ongoing. And you all should have been informed about this beforehand, so you know that you will be recorded. And yeah, also the slides and the recording will be made available later, so that you can check, or in case you have somebody who missed the seminar, you can share this then. Okay. Yeah, we will do the Q&As after both speakers have presented. This is just easier to manage. So we aim for now 25 minutes of presentation by Dr. Ronny Rothbart. And then we will have for the same amount of time presentation by Professor Isla Meyer-Smith. And then we have time for discussion, and I'm very much looking forward to it. The focus today is on boreal forests, and you all probably have followed the COP discussions, which were very much centered on forest, very much on tropical forest, but overall, I think that the challenge is the same. We want to make sure that these forests remain active ecosystem, provide biodiversity, habitat for biodiversity, and of course also store a lot of carbon and are part of a healthy Earth system. That's why we are here. So you can be, let's say, positive or negative about the outcomes of the COP. I think the urgency is clear, and also what needs to be done on an international level is quite clear. So I think it's very important that we keep on continuing to understand and to highlighting the threat and also the risks that those different ecosystems are facing. And therefore, I'm very happy that we focus on boreal forests. As you know, the northern regions are warming faster than most of the rest of the world. And the ecosystems are particularly affected by large-scale disturbances. So there is a lot of interesting dynamics at play. Our first speaker today will be Dr. Ronny Rothbart. He has a background in environmental sciences and nature conservation. so a strongly ecological background, and he gained his PhD at Wageningen University, which, as many of you know, has a very strong focus on tipping and resilience. And yeah, he's of course fascinated by the idea of resilience and the ability of complex system to withstand or recover from disturbances. He has been using both field and satellite data to understand the driving forces of resilience in both the temperate and the boreal zones to climate change, impact outbreaks, and also drought. And today he is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Freiburg in Germany. And Ronny, we are very happy that you are with us today, and I'm very excited to see your presentation. So please go ahead, share your screen, and then I hand over to you. And thanks again for joining today.
Thank you, Christopher. I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay, I hope this works.
Yes, very good.
Yeah, good. Well, first of all, thank you, Christopher, for the nice introduction, and thanks for the organizing committee to give me the opportunity to present some of my work on shifts and tipping in boreal forests. Now, with these sort of webinars, it's always a bit tricky. I'm extremely excited to talk, but it's also a bit strange because you never know who your audience is, as compared to lectures or conferences. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about or setting the scene on boreal forests a bit. So we start off very, very soft, and then we go into the more details of my work, and then Ayla can take it from there in her talk. A lot of the work that I'm going to present today stems from my PhD research at the University of Wageningen. And you can see here that, of course, this is not a one-man show, but there's quite a big team, and the team is actually even bigger than the people I mentioned here. So let's get right into it. And I always like to start with this picture. It's a photo that I've taken in the interior of Alaska, near Fairbanks, near the city of Fairbanks. And to me, this is a nice representation of what boreal forests could be. Now, of course, this is only one image from one particular spot within this vast biome, but it gives sort of an idea of the vastness, but also the incredible diversity that we see here. And of course, it's a very wild landscape. I mean, coming from Central Europe, these types of landscapes are nothing that we see, in our parts anymore. So I'm quite fascinated with that. But apart from that, of course, boreal forests have or play a big role globally, but also locally and regionally. But first of all, let me just roughly sketch where boreal forests are. So here we have a map that's sort of centered on the North Pole, and then the land masses around it. So everything that's sort of colored here are what we consider, or what we can consider, boreal forests. So we cover large parts of Scandinavia, Siberia, Alaska, and Canada. So a really vast biome we talk about. And in terms of the importance, boreal forests are not only habitat to, iconic species such as, bears or moose, but also to, millions of birds, migratory birds that use, these landscapes for as breeding sites. There are millions of indigenous people that call this area home and have very, very strong connections, also culturally, to these landscapes. As you can imagine, with the sheer amount of trees for the timber industry, this is also a really important biome and habitat, and it stores huge amounts of water. But maybe sort of the biggest role, in my opinion, that has global relevance is really that boreal forests are what we can consider a climate regulator, in a sense that this huge biome stores an incredible amount of carbon. And what you see here on this image is in green is the carbon that's stored in the above ground vegetation of our global biomes. And I pinpointed here the tropical forests and also the boreal forests. So you can, I mean, there's already quite a lot of carbon stored in trees and the vegetation. But what really makes boreal forests stand out as a carbon storage is the vast amount of carbon that's stored in the soil. And as you can imagine, the idea is that this carbon stays where it is. But as you will see in my talk and also in the talk of Ayla, that may not necessarily be the case. Now, boreal forests are under global change or subject to global change in many different ways. First of all, we have an increase in temperatures that affects different parts of boreal forests in a different way. We have also the occurrence of droughts and an increase in drought conditions, also an increase in the size, the frequency, and also the severity of wildfires. In the same way, we see an increase in the intensity of insect outbreaks. And above all of that is the impact that we humans have, for example, through timber extraction. So the question is really, how do these forests deal with all of these changes? And to start answering that question, I'd like to go back to this guy. Alexander von Humboldt, he was, as many of you will know, a naturalist born in Berlin or near Berlin in the 18th century. And he has really made a big name for himself in trying to understand nature and natural processes. And one of his, let's say, big, in my opinion, one of the biggest revelations that he is part of is the connection between vegetation and climate. So what I'm showing here is a map that he prepared back in the 19th century, where in his first step he put down areas of equal temperatures. So those are these isotherm lines that you see here, these sort of dashed lines that you can see. And through his extensive expeditions through different parts of the world, he quickly recognized that certain plant species and certain vegetation types would co-occur in areas that have equal temperatures. And he created this map of these sort of what we may call biomes or ecozones today. He created this map and was one of the first to make this connection between vegetation and climate. Now, in a time of climate change, the time we are in right now, we can reverse or rephrase this question to vegetation follows climate, question mark. Because the idea is, well, if there is such a strong connection between the vegetation zones and climate, and in this case, temperature, what happens? I mean, does it mean that if temperatures increase, do we also see sort of a shift of the vegetation? And to sort of give an idea of what this could mean, I have just prepared a little overview with this sort of polygon art here, which is a very simplified representation of boreal forests. And so you can see here that we are moving from the south and the foreground to the north and the background. And we start off with the hemiboreal forests. That's just another name for these transitional forests between the boreal and temperate forests. We have the southern boreal, the interior or the core of boreal forests, the northern boreal, and at some points we lose all the trees and we reach the Arctic tundra. And the occurrence of boreal forests can be sort of delineated, right, with these blue lines that I put in here. Now, with a lot, I mean, there's it's quite complicated why this wiggly line is where it is, but a large contributor to that is temperature. and now, as I said before, what happens if now these temperatures start to increase? Do we also see a shift of that whole biome? And that shift could happen in several ways. The first one would be that along the southern boreal forest, we may lose forests, or at least the specific boreal tree species, because temperatures may exceed certain thresholds where trees may not grow anymore, or they may, maybe threatened with mortality. But at the same time, we may see these intensification of disturbances such as wildfires. But then on the other hand, in the more northern parts where temperatures have been fairly cold and are now becoming milder, the question is vegetation responding with an increase in growth conditions? In growth rates. And finally, we may even see the expansion of boreal forests through the colonization of, areas that have not been where we didn't find trees in the past. So that's sort of the theory. And yeah, these interesting, the very interesting sort of shifts or tipping points, as we may want to call them, they occur at these two lines, because this is where we see we may see this really radical change in biomes, right? And this is also recognized by the international community, and they have put down what they call these tipping elements of the Earth system, and two of them are depicted here, which I'm going to talk to today, which is the boreal forest southern dieback. That's what I just showed you, and the northern expansion. And yeah, over the past 4 or 5 years, we've tried to get an answer for whether these tipping points really exist. So the big question was whether we find evidence that these tipping points or shifts are already underway. And a second big question was how boreal forests look like in the future if these shifts really occur. So to answer that first question, what we've done was that we looked at tree cover, so the area, the surface area that is covered by trees, as observed from space. So we use satellite data, specifically satellite data over the North American boreal forests over the last 20 years, so from the year 2000 to 2019. And what we did was we just generally wanted to know where or how tree cover in these North American boreal forests changed over these past 20 years. And on this map here, you see in green all the areas where we see an increase of tree cover, so a densening of the forests. And in sort of pinkish colors, you see all the areas where we see a decline. And sort of by just eyeballing this map, maybe you can already start to see a pattern where perhaps some of these pinker areas occur predominantly in the southern parts of boreal forests. But of course, as scientists, we wanted to know this a bit more in detail. So what we've done was we basically went on a journey. I mean, digitally on a journey from the southern boundary to the northern boundary along several sort of let's say vertical lines, if you will, through the boreal forest, and then try to see whether or how tree cover has changed over the past 20 years, whether it increased or decreased, and then we made a sort of a mean calculation from that. And this is sort of the result that we see. So this sort of, well, let's say squeezed line, or the main line, is the one here in the center, the vertical line that you see, which represents the boreal forest going from the southern boundary through the interior of the boreal forest all the way to the north. And you see in green again all where tree cover increased, or in pink where tree cover decreased. And what we can see is that along or around the southern boundary here, this is the area where tree cover losses dominate. And once we move further into the interior, especially the northern interior of boreal forests, we see this big spike in tree cover increases. So that's pretty much kind of what we expected, right? But now something unexpected happens, because once we move further to the northern boundary and then sort of towards the Arctic tundra, we see this sharp decline again. Along this northern boundary, not much is really happening, and that was quite surprising. So this doesn't really fit sort of the theory, right, that we just talked about. Yeah, to just make that relation again to this abstract, right, our simplistic boreal forest, then we see that a lot of the theory sort of, at least we find some evidence for that, except for this expansion in the north, which we don't really find much evidence for. And how are we doing on time? Christopher?
Yes, you have 8 to 10 more minutes, so all
Okay,
good.
wonderful. All right. So we also wanted to, or we also tried to understand what are the potential drivers that explain these patterns of tree cover changes. And what we found is that there's two main, well, actually there's three ones, three sort of drivers. The first one are disturbances such as wildfire, but also logging. That contributed a lot to the tree cover losses, as you can imagine. But besides those, we also see a big relationship with temperature. So what we see here is sort of mirrored in the figure that I showed you before. We have this sort of sweet spot, if you will, in temperature where tree cover change or tree cover increases are highest, and then if we either go to the northern end or the southern end of the boreal biome, we see this sharp decline or even a loss of tree cover. And the interesting thing is that our study was not the first one to investigate this question, right? A year earlier, before we published, there was another paper where Logan Berner and Scott Gutt did an analysis, a similar analysis to ours, but they didn't use tree cover, but NDVI. So that's basically an index that stands for, let's say, the productivity of forests. And what they found is that the temperature plays a really big role here as well. So in green, these are all the areas in the boreal forests where productivity increased, and in brown where productivity decreased. And what they found was that in these milder regions of the boreal forest, we have a much higher dominance of an increase in productivity. But as soon as we go towards the warmer southern boundary, we see that this sort of reverse, right? It switches, and a decline in productivity is something that we see most often. So this is very similar to the patterns that we observed. The second one, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes, is tree cover, which may sound a bit strange at first if you think about it, right? So this basically means it relates the change of tree cover to the mean tree cover that we observe in certain regions. And again, we have this sort of sweet spot in this intermediate tree cover range, where we see sort of a densening of forests. And where forests are quite dense, so that's mainly the southern parts, we have these very notable tree cover losses. And again, if we make this comparison to the other paper, then we see again this switch, similar to what we find, right? At higher tree cover, in areas with higher tree cover, we see a dominance of a decline in productivity. So that was quite interesting to see. So this was sort of the evidence that we have from past observations, right? But of course, you may say, well, that's all nice, but are these changes going to continue? And if so, what would boreal forests look like? And that's the second part that I want to address real quick. So now we are getting a bit more into let's say, resilience theory or theories of stable and unstable states. So I'm just going to walk you through some of the basics here. So in this image, I try this yellow line that you see here is essentially a very simplistic representation of the results that we've seen, right? So the relationship between tree cover and tree cover change. And if you look at this more carefully, you can say, well, if I start, can you, by the way, see my cursor? I hope so.
Yeah, we see it, but it's very
Hmm.
small, so you
It's
have to
very small.
explain it also.
Uh, is this working? Oops. Well, okay, yeah. So let's say we are somewhere in the center, in the sort of intermediate tree cover range here, where if we, if we have a look at this graph, we have a pretty high increase in tree cover. So the tree cover would move towards the right along this axis here, and then we can check further along this axis, and we see, okay, tree cover is still increasing, and so forth. So eventually these points in here would accumulate or would reach this black solid dot or circle on the right hand side. Similarly, if we go all the way to the far right, where forests are dense, you see there's, this is an area of tree cover loss. So again, we get to this point here. So we consider this a stable state. Similarly, on the left-hand side, on the far left, there's also a point where most regions would move to over time if this relationship continues. So we can use this. We can use this relationship between tree cover and tree cover change to plot the distribution density that we expect from this. So we would expect that most regions of the boreal forest would accumulate either on this left or the far right circle or tree cover. And we can then compare this distribution density with the observed distribution density as it is right now. And if there is sort of if there's a mismatch between those two, that is an indication for unstable states of the forests. So we've done this, and this time we went global. So we looked at the global boreal forests, and we randomly distributed, I think it was 2 million data points across this biome, and extracted tree cover over the past, this time 25 years, because there was some time that, in between these studies. And in the first step, we first wanted to say, well, wanted to see how does the distribution of tree cover look like over the past 25 years. And what you see here on the x-axis, you see again tree cover. On the y-axis, you see temperature. Just so you know, the axis is reversed. So the negative temperatures are at the top to just represent that this is the northern boreal, and at the bottom is the southern boreal. And the colors represent how many of those points, of those 2 million points, actually occur in these tree cover regions. And what we see in yellow, there's two yellow blobs. And those are the two very distinct states of boreal forests. So in the more colder regions, we have this state that is sort of very open, 10 to 20% tree cover. And then in the warmer southern regions, we have tree covers of about 60 or 70%. So this fits very well with also the processes and the ecology of boreal forests, how we understand it. This is the current situation. Now, now in the next step, we wanted to see, well, how has tree cover changed, along this temperature tree cover spectrum. And on this, on this figure, so again, it's tree cover and it's temperature. But this time the color represents either tree cover increases or tree cover decreases. And what we can already see is something very similar to what we noticed in our first study, and that is that also on the global boreal forest, we have this really strong separation between areas of tree cover decreases and area of tree cover increases. And there's sort of this dashed black line in between, and that is sort of the stable state that I talked about a few minutes ago. So this is where we would expect most of the tree cover to move to across most of the boreal forests. And this is what we've done. So we've done a simulation between the year 2000 and 2100, so 100 years. And we said, okay, let's just do this. Let's just sort of make a model that simulates how tree cover will change in this temperature tree cover spectrum. And yeah, this is what we find. So this is basically the projected tree cover distribution in the year 2100, where we see a large accumulation of areas around this what we call open forest state. So this intermediate tree cover state between, let's say, 35 and maybe 55%. With one exception, again, and that is the very cold areas in the north where tree cover has not really moved much. And so this is a comparison again. So on the top, this is the sort of the condition in the year 2000, and at the bottom, the projected one in the year 2100. So this is quite a considerable change. And the biggest message here is that we are moving away from this two-state boreal forest, like the boreal forest with two distinct states, towards one that has one open state that's more or less uniform. We've then translated that into above ground biomass, because we also wanted to see whether that also means, if some areas are losing tree cover and others are increasing tree cover, what does that do in terms of the above ground biomass and the carbon that is stored in there? What's the overall effect? And here on this map, you see sort of the geographical distribution of these changes. So in red, areas where biomass decreases or may decrease until the year 2100, and then in blue, where it increases. Overall, we find an 11% increase of above ground biomass increase over the entire global boreal forests. However, and that's maybe something that Ayla may talk about in a bit, this does not consider the carbon and the huge stores of carbon in the soil that I talked about at the beginning.
One more minute, maybe, Ronnie,
Thank you. Yeah,
please.
that's all I need. And then in addition, this sort of new open forest state, if it would actually be reached, it will lie in an area of increased fire risk. So here, I just put down the fire probability observed over the past 25 years on this tree cover spectrum, and sort of these dashed lines indicate this open forest state, and you see this is really where fire probability peaks. So yeah, to conclude, I think what we found was that we do see evidence, especially along the southern boreal forests, where through a combination of disturbance and warming, we see sort of this dieback, whereas we see a sort of densening of boreal forests in the core distribution, but not an expansion towards Arctic tundra. And we may see that boreal forests are sort of shifting towards this open forest state. And I'm happy to discuss this further with all of you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ronnie, for this excellent presentation. Really nice and clear. So yeah, please give him a warm applause. And of course, do not hesitate to put your questions in the Q&A. Yeah, we will move forward in a second to the next speaker. But please already now start putting your questions so that we can maybe sort them, or you see what others are asking. That's the advantage of a webinar, right? That you can be interactive on the questions. So don't be shy, just move forward. And thanks again, Ronnie, for this very nice presentation. And yeah, you see you have all the links to the very nice papers here. So thank you so much. This was really nice. And if you can unshare now, yeah, thanks a lot, because then I can introduce our next speaker, which is Professor Ayla Meyer-Smith from the University of British Columbia, as well as the Canadian Excellence Research Chair in Global Change Ecology of the Northern Hemisphere. Sorry, I had to read this. That's why it sounds a bit weird. Your work has been mostly focusing on trends and impact of Arctic vegetation change and why the Arctic is greening or also browning, I assume. So a bit following along the lines of what Ronnie just showed. And as you know, this browning or greening has been subject to a lot of debates, giving whether you use models or satellite or other observations to test for it. So I'm very curious what you will tell us about. Yeah, you have been working a lot with international research, but also northern communities and governments. And your aim is really to understand the processes that are behind increases in shrubs in tundra ecosystems, and how does it affect wildlife habitats, but also permafrost thaw and others. So Ayla, thanks a lot for joining. It's very early for you. We really understand that, and while it's still already night here in Germany, it's maybe just getting daytime in Canada. So thanks a lot for getting up early and for squeezing this in your busy day. Yeah, again, the floor is yours for 20 to 25 minutes. As we discussed, I will give you a short heads up if time is up. And for everybody else, please, yeah, sit back and enjoy this very nice presentation.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for the lovely introduction. I will attempt to share my slides here. All right. Well, that was a perfect intro, Ronnie, into what I'm talking about. I was banking on you covering some of the general content, so thank you very much. And it's great to get
Ayla, you're still in the presenter, or not in the presenter's mode. I think you clicked something else before, and then it was on the big screen.
Not on my end, interestingly. I can try stopping sharing and starting again, maybe. Oh, let's try this. Pressing a different button. Does that work? Interesting. We didn't have this problem when we tested
No,
it.
in the technical check, it looked all good, but at least to me, you are still in the, in the way we see all the slides. I don't know, it's maybe.
Will start again. I'm just going to use the desktop sharing, I think. Let's try that.
Yeah. Now it looks good.
Okay, so
thank you so much.
Too many options in Zoom. All right, so as I was saying, so it was great to get the perspective of Ronnie on what's happening to the trees in the boreal forest, and I will try and fill in some of the other processes and the changes that are going on. So I wanted to start, just as Ronnie started, with the kind of global scale feedback. So we care about what happens in the boreal forest because some of these feedbacks and potential tipping points have the potential to influence the global climate. And if you look at some of the papers and work on global tipping points, boreal forest shifts are one of the primary examples, but there's a few other high latitude things going on, including permafrost thaw and also loss of ice sheets. And these are some of the really big global tipping points that we need to think about as we move into a warmer climate over the coming years. And as Ronnie talked about, we have satellite data and on-the-ground evidence of a greening of tundra ecosystems and also in the boreal forest. So this is Logan Berner's paper showing the greening and browning, very similar to what Ronnie produced, but this is the NDVI index. But there's these patches of greening and these patches of browning and maybe different ecological things going on the ground. So for example, there could be these dynamics in terms of how tree line is moving, and Ronnie talked about that. There could be this dieback in the southern boreal forest. For example, the larch in Russia is showing enhanced stress, and that can also lead to forest fires. And then something I'm going to talk about in this talk, which is the concept and idea of boreal shrubification. So the increase in shrubs in the understory or in open areas within the boreal forest that could also be increasing. And then underlaying all this is what's happening in the below ground environment. And as Ronnie alluded to, like a lot of the carbon that is stored within the planet's soils are stored at these high latitudes. And if permafrost thaws and if the vegetation changes on the surface, that carbon is vulnerable to loss. And the other factor that's going on, of course, is the intensification of the forest fire cycle. And so a lot of the sort of biomass losses that we might pick up as browning in these systems are created by forest fires, which we're now seeing, particularly in given years, greater extents of area that burns and then more intense fires. And there's many more examples of sort of local scale dynamics that are influencing this greening and browning signal at the biome scale. And the other thing that I think is worth thinking about when we're thinking about the concept of tipping points is the sort of pace and rate of the change that's going on. So we have some of the changes that we could consider to be more gradual. They're caused by sort of direct linear forcing. So a lot of the sort of warming effects we see in ecosystems, I would often put in this gradual category. And then other types of change that we see can move quite rapidly. So at the scale of possibly years or decades, and resulting in quite a large scale change. But it's not exactly abrupt change, which is the final category here, where you really see a system transitioning to a new state very, very quickly. And so thinking about the pace of change, I think influences our understanding of the state that ends up and how quickly we end up in that state, which has really important implications for trying to model, say, carbon release from these systems and these global scale climate feedbacks. And to just give you an example using permafrost thaw, so you can have a deepening of the active layer, which can be gradual but a very substantial change that builds incrementally over time as the climate warms. You can have more rapid change like permafrost degradation at the surface, which could be, say, the development of water tracks within landscapes. And then you can have abrupt change like landslides or active layer detachments, where you go from one state to the other state in that localized area in a matter of seconds to minutes. And so all these changes are interacting, and there's a connection between active layer change and a resulting active layer detachment, the changing hydrology in the middle, but that pace of change can be quite different. So Ronnie talked in his talk about tree line advance, and it's one of the things that often comes up when we think about that state change in boreal systems, that it's the trees that maybe are the big factor we need to be thinking about. And a recent paper, not by Ronnie, just to broaden our perspective here, is by a postdoc who's just joined my lab, Hannah Travers-Smith, who has looked at tree line advance across northern Canada. And what she found was a slight increase over a 36-year period, so more advanced than retreat, but generally quite a stable tree line. And so you can zoom into that map and you can sort of see what these data look like. And she used ISAT2 and Landsat data together to infer structural change at the tree line. And so you can see that sort of movement of the yellow, the higher canopy height, into the lower canopy height lands beyond tree line. And when she was doing this analysis, she was also able to detect tall shrubs and how they are changing at this sort of tree line ecotone. And what she found was both evidence of new shrub growth beyond the tree line and also shrub infilling within the boreal forest zone. And I might make the argument that what's happening to the other species within the boreal forest, in particular, the under canopy of shrubs, could be as big of a deal, perhaps a bigger deal than what's happening with the trees. So this question of boreal shrubification is something that I want to devote a bit of time to in the coming years, and we've started thinking about it in my research group. So this is the central Yukon. We've been working across the Yukon territory and really thinking about shrub change from the boreal forest up into the alpine and Arctic tundra. And when we are looking in tundra ecosystems, we see a relatively strong signal that at least over parts of the landscape, shrubs are increasing. So here's an example of what that looks like. So this is a site where a photograph was taken in the 1980s, and that we revisit that site every time we go to the field site and capture the change that's going on. So here's the photograph from the 1980s. It's a bit blurry, but what you can see here is a landscape with a creek running through it where there are shrubs in the background, but mostly what you're seeing are horsetails and sedges and buttercups. But by the 2000s, when I started working at the site, you can see these willows coming into that landscape. And as we visit the site year after year, you can see those willows growing and becoming more dominant within this landscape. And here is the photograph from this summer. So you can see quite a verdant shrubby landscape in this tundra ecosystem. So here we're maybe 100 kilometers north of tree line, but shrubification is very clear in this type of a system, and in part because there isn't a tree canopy blocking our vision of what's happening below that canopy. So it gets trickier when you move into the boreal forest. And in fact, there's not that much research on this question of boreal shrubification. So we've been working on putting together a literature review of the boreal shrubification studies, and they come from different contexts within the boreal forest. So whether it's within a closed canopy forest through to peatlands, where it's the sort of open peatland part of the landscape where shrubs have been observed to increase. So these are the studies to date-ish. We should update this literature review. But it's an interesting question to ask ourselves. Is the magnitude of change going on in terms of increases in shrubs similar within the boreal forest as to what's happening in the tundra, or are there different factors at play? And here's just a few photographs of what that type of change can look like, but we have very limited examples out there that I have found, but particularly in the one from northern Quebec here on the one slide, you can really see those shrubs coming into this boreal landscape. And another question that we're quite interested in the lab is about the concept of borealization, and this is work by Maria Garcia Criado, who was a postdoc in our lab. And what she has found through her work is that about 50% of plots found within the tundra biome show evidence of colonization and increase in abundance of boreal plant species. So it's not just about tree lines moving north, also other plants from boreal communities are showing evidence of moving into the tundra, and they're showing perhaps a faster response than what we see with trees. And then, as Ronnie alluded to, it's not just what's happening on the above ground part of these landscapes, it's what's happening below ground that perhaps really matters to those global scale feedbacks. So that permafrost thaw feedback interacting with the boreal forest type feedbacks might be where the real sort of climate tipping points might lie. And the Arctic and the boreal forest are in the regions of the planet that are warming most rapidly, and permafrost is thawing as a result. And almost a quarter of the northern hemisphere is underlain by permafrost. And so if we lose that permafrost, then that carbon can move into the atmosphere or into other parts of the system. And up to a third of the world's soil carbon is stored at high latitudes. So loss of carbon from permafrost soils is one of the bigger sort of ecosystem level climate feedbacks, and one that has the potential to be a very strong tipping point as well. So we see gradual thaw across high latitudes, and this is a recentish paper demonstrating sort of what that looks like. So you have places where there is a significant increase in gradual thaw, a slight increase, and then places where there's a bit of decrease going on depending on the climate over long periods of time. And we also have evidence of abrupt thaw, as I talked about in the beginning of the talk, these sort of thermokarst features, retrogressive thaw slumps, active layer detachments, and where those are happening within high latitudes. They are often restricted to sort of more ice-rich permafrost settings, so they're not found necessarily everywhere across the high latitudes. And I wanted to bring a specific example of a permafrost thaw event that happened at our Arctic field site in 2023. So for those of you who work in high latitude ecosystems or live within Canada, for example, you'll remember 2023 because that was the big forest fire year in the Canadian Arctic and high latitudes. And part of the reason for that was there was a large sort of heat wave, a heat dome that formed over the Western Arctic. And that heat dome in July was very much based over our Arctic field site, Qeqertaraq, on the Yukon Arctic coast. So you can see that map of the anomalies of temperatures there. And what has been happening at this site is a deepening of the active layer over time. And in this year, in 2023, the active layer reached its deepest thaw level yet, based on the records that we have, reaching up to 1 meter. And what happened next was an event of active layer detachment landslides happening all across the landscape. So over 1% of the island, the tundra was sort of ripped off the slopes and slid down the hill just within a couple of weeks. Each of these slides was rapid, and this one in particular happened within a matter of seconds. We heard it, we didn't see it with our own eyes, but we were able to get there with the drone right after it happened. And so this is an example where a gradual change, that active layer the active layer depth getting deeper and deeper and deeper, interacted with a heat wave event that led to an abrupt change at this location. And I want to throw forest fires into the mix. So often we sort of combine forest fires with the sort of boreal forest climate feedback, but they are sort of a separate process in their own right that are undergoing feedbacks as well. So we see a cumulative increase in burned area, and again, it's spatially variable where that's happening around the northern latitudes of the planet. And we also see a trend in increasing burned area, with some places showing more positive trends relative to others. And I'll bring you back to that 2023 year. So this is us up in the Arctic, and we were enveloped in forest fire smoke because of all the fires that were happening to the south of us. And the 2023 year, in terms of fire, was by far the biggest burned area throughout time in Canada. So a really dramatic pulse or peak in burned area across that summer. And you could argue that that in itself was an abrupt change that makes us think that a tipping point may be on the way with the forest fire cycle. And if we have more frequent and intense fires in these systems, the boreal forest itself will shift. And so we have evidence from a variety of studies now that if you have a more frequent and intense fire cycle, you move towards more deciduous trees, away from the coniferous trees of the boreal forest. And then that also means that there's less carbon stored in the soils beneath those trees because of the way those two forest types protect carbon within permafrost soils. And so this sort of brings it together a bit. We have this question of how the sort of carbon state of the boreal forest is sitting, and you could think of it as this kind of balance between increased productivity in a lot of the boreal forest, but as Ronnie pointed out, not everywhere, with shrubs and trees increasing, and then permafrost thaw and forest fire leading to losses of carbon. And that begs the question of where does the balance lie at the current time? And there's a great new study by Anna Virkala looking at where within the high latitudes carbon uptake is greater versus the losses being greater. So where the sources and sinks of carbon are within these high latitudes. And you can see it illustrated here. So currently, still according to this work, apart from where there are forest fires, the southern reaches of the boreal forest are mostly a sink. And as you move northwards, it's more of a source. And then the big question that I think various of the modeling projects are working on is really trying to project this forward. So where does the balance lie as we move forward? And through the talk I've presented today, I hope you're sort of thinking about the fact that there are these gradual all the way through to abrupt changes that are probably moving us towards both the tundra biome and the boreal forest becoming more of a source over time. And so we can think about the changes that I've discussed today and that Ronnie discussed. Some of those changes are more gradual. So the active layer increases, the sort of warmer and drier summers leading to drought stress in trees, and then warmer and wetter summers in some other contexts leading to tree line advance and increased productivity within these systems. Then you have some of the more rapid, but not necessarily abrupt change, different types of permafrost degradation occurring, that sort of change in the fire cycle towards more intense fires, and things like shrubification that I would argue can move much faster than a tree line advance. So that is a much more rapid productivity change that can go on in the boreal forest. And then you have the abrupt changes at play. So thermokarst, those kind of really dramatic change that can happen and are influenced by the gradual and rapid change. And then these big fire years that can occur that can really change locally the carbon cycle. And all of that feeds back to influencing carbon emissions. But a point I want to leave you on is that not all of the feedbacks are positive here. So if you have a greater burned area, and we saw this in Ronnie's work and also in Hannah's work, that can influence the tree line, it can influence productivity within these systems, and more forest fires at tree line can lead to tree line retreat. And having the forest transition into a more deciduous forest with more deciduous trees, but also shrubs, could have influence on the carbon cycle as well. So there could be more biomass within the trees and the shrubs, but potentially less carbon within the soil. So it could be a negative or a positive feedback. And the shrubification itself should be putting more biomass into the system. So lots of complexity with the positive feedbacks at play. I think this is the challenge for modelers and the model intercomparison projects to really think about how models are capturing the gradual, the rapid, and the abrupt change, and how the positive and the negative feedbacks are parameterized, and whether we're capturing what is really going on in the boreal forest. And so I'll bring you back to the slide I started with and thinking about that greening and browning within the boreal forest, the specific site and regional level change that's going on and how that factors into the global carbon cycle. So I think there's lots of work to do, but lots of interesting things to ponder about how we can best capture the change that's going on within the boreal forest. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Ayla. Really exciting and also perfect timing. So we have plenty of time for discussions and everything. But really, thanks a lot. Very clear, very nice pictures. Yeah, very, I think, impressive to see these ecosystems over, a time frame of, I don't know, 30 years to change that much. So within a lifetime of the scientists going there, so many things going on. Really, thanks a lot. Yeah. So we are very good in time. We have basically half an hour for questions and discussions, and there are already some in the chat. I will start in a second, but just for all those who maybe joined late or didn't plan to ask a question, but now you have some, you have to ask them in the Q&A tool, because otherwise they will be not visible or not entirely visible to us. So please take the time to put your question into the Q&A tool, because that's where they will be seen and also answered. And if you have very technical questions, they may be already answered on the fly by Ronnie or Ayla typing something there. So just make sure you put your question into the Q&A tool. And we have already quite some questions there. At the moment, there are 5, and I think I need to sort the lower ones a bit, but I think the third one by Min Jung Kwon is actually one that matches both talks. So I would start with this one. I think originally it was directed to Ronnie. And the question is whether boreal forests will be largely affected by temperature or are already largely affected. What about the role of drought? Yeah. Is it less a concern because forests have a lot of soil water already? So Ronnie, maybe you can start, but Ayla, I think I also had this similar question because you mentioned the connection to fire, but maybe the other processes that you mentioned would also be affected by drought. So please, would be also great to get your perspective in a second. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a really, really interesting point. I think, in my opinion, the short answer to that question is yes. Droughts play a really big role, but as both Ayla and myself have pointed out, the boreal biome is incredibly diverse. So the climatic conditions differ quite a lot. So it really depends on where in the boreal forest you are. And where sort of these drought conditions and soil water conditions may interact. I think where droughts can or may particularly be relevant would be along the boundaries of boreal forests where precipitation or water availability in general is already quite low. We see when you look at, let's say, satellite images, and you go in sort of into Central Asia or into the Midwest of the US, and you move further north, you'll see this really sharp edge between the temperate grasslands or the steppes, right? And then towards the boreal forest, there's this really distinct, clear line that you can see that determines where water availability may support the presence of trees. And as you can imagine, if water availability declines over time because of climate change and climatic processes, that may drive a further sort of retreat of that sharp line further north.
Ayla, you want to add on that?
Great. Yeah, I'll just contribute because Ronnie's answer was excellent. Maybe building on what he was talking about in his talk and in the answer there, the southern reaches of the boreal forest often tend to show more evidence for drought stress. And as Ronnie also alluded to, the boreal forest is very big biome, circles the entire planet. So there are places within the boreal forest that are quite wet already, so they're climatically experience higher precipitation, and then there's places that experience lower precipitation. So those lower precipitation sites, or also it's important to think about the snowpack versus summer precipitation too. Those trees are probably more vulnerable to feeling the effects of drought. And then at the sort of localized scales, it's quite interesting in these permafrost systems because of the way drainage works and the fact that the trees have to keep their roots very close to the surface if the active layer isn't very deep. Even in a very wet environment like a wetland, if your roots are in the very surfaces of the soil, you can experience drought stress. So even a place that looks incredibly wet can still be quite vulnerable to drought for the trees and for the shrubs as well. And another sort of thing to add on, I have a student, Sarah, who's thinking about how we project how different species will expand or retract with climate change. And we usually rely very heavily on just temperature relationships there to make those projections, and bringing in the sort of soil moisture or moisture niche of a species to understand how it might respond in future is sort of an area we really need to go, and we start to think forward to what the boreal forest could look like in the future.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And actually that's, I wanted to come back to this point, but maybe let's do it right now, because this species on the move thing, I think, is a very important one. So I will ask a few of the other questions later, but I really would like then to ask, so these questions, or two questions that have been asked by Alexandre, because it really means it goes into this direction. So does the southern dieback mean that there will be no more trees in the southern parts of Canada, or does it mean other types of trees or vegetation that will come in? So and related to this is, what does it mean for conservation and protected areas? Yeah. So what are the implications for the design of networks of protected areas, for example? And my own question on top of that is then, when you look at how the species changed, you refer always to, let's say, plants in the wider sense, or do you also monitor insects and maybe other like smaller animals that are not, say, moving over large areas, like those iconic species that we heard about in the beginning? Of course, the bears and the moose and so on, they move quite a lot. But yeah, what about the monitoring of smaller animals, and in general, what type of questions or challenges arise for protected area management from this switch in ecosystem and species distributions? And again, it's for both of you, but Ayla, maybe you want to start first, because it's directly, part of the question is directly related to Canada's national park system and so on.
Great. Yes, I'll do it in reverse, I think. So I'll start with insects, because it was something I was considering putting in my talk, and I thought, no, I'll run out of time. Of course, a really big factor at play within Canadian boreal forests and lower latitude forests are insect disturbances, and also within Fennoscandia. And so as you get warmer temperatures, you can get these different types of insects. So whether it's Lepidoptera, who eat the leaves of the trees, through to bark beetles that go through the bark and can girdle the cambium. Those insects can do better in warmer years, particularly if the winters stay warmer, so they can survive over winter better. And then that can lead to stress on trees and or mortality for trees. And then you have more standing dead within the systems, making those forests much more vulnerable to forest fire. So there's a strong positive feedback there between insect outbreaks and forest fires that I think people are working on capturing and modeling, but could become a much bigger deal in future, and potentially influencing more areas of the boreal forest than are currently influenced by that now. And then just to broaden it up, I talked briefly about the borealization, so the movement of boreal plants into the tundra biome. The same thing is going on with animals. So you see moose and beaver and other species that tend to prefer boreal habitats moving into tundra habitats, as particularly things like the shrubs increase. And so the tundra becomes more similar to the boreal forest and a habitat that's more appropriate for some of those species. So, and some of those species like beaver are ecosystem engineers, and moose for that matter. And so they are reshaping those higher latitude ecosystems. So you have a lot of species shifts at play, and some of those species shifts are going to have pretty substantial impacts that will influence these global scale feedbacks. So maybe I'll answer that part, and I'm going to hand the southern boreal forest over to Ronnie, because I think he's got more research expertise in that area. But I think it is something that, park managers and ecosystem managers do need to be thinking about in future. And that's true for a lot of the biomes of the planet that we sometimes, or at least in my work, I tend to focus on the northern latitude range expansions and forget about what's happening at the southern ranges. So over to Ronnie.
Yeah. So in terms of the southern dieback, so as I've shown in this sort of second study that we did, the projection of tree cover, then we see that while we see a loss of tree cover over the past decades, this doesn't mean that we're going to lose the boreal forests altogether. But they may just sort of rearrange and may sort of settle in this what we call this open state. However, we have to be a bit cautious also with our study, because what we used was a tree cover estimate from space. So this data set does not distinguish between different types of forests or different tree species. So it just says, well, this percentage of the landscape is covered by trees. That's pretty much it. So there's only so much we can say about the changes that we see. The fact that we see tree cover losses may indeed be an indication for the fact that the let's say climatic stress, in addition to perhaps the influence of disturbance and wildfire and logging, may lead to this loss, but it may not mean that we're going to lose forests altogether. I actually think that we're going to see a compositional change in these parts, and that could mean a change towards different tree species, maybe more temperate tree species, in most parts at least. Not in all parts for sure, because I'm pretty certain that in those areas that are already at sort of the very climatic extremes, in terms of, we just touched upon it, in terms of droughts or water availability, we're likely going to see a loss of forest altogether. Yeah. So it depends a bit on the region, and as Ayla just said, it's not only about the trees. So we may also see a change of let's say the understory vegetation, or a change in let's say sort of the herbaceous layer in these parts, and that can all play a big role. Yeah, and I just wanted to say that these questions about what does that mean for management of forests, but also protected areas. I mean, that's a really excellent question, and it's a question that not only concerns boreal forests. I mean, now that I work here in Freiburg, I'm part of a team. We look at sort of European or more regional forests in Central Europe, and we have similar questions. Is how can we maintain the functions of the forests that we, but also sort of natural processes depend on, and what is sort of the strategy that we go for? Are we saying, well, nature is going to handle it, and we'll see what happens, or are we saying, well, no, let's be more proactive in that regard by let's say supporting the migration of tree species that may be, or any vegetation or even animal species that may be more suitable for, or more, let's say, more suitable for the changes in environmental and climatic conditions. I hope that answers the question a bit.
That's a very, very good, also very good transition to my next point, because I found again two nice questions that we can group together. Victor Brovkin was asking on the reversibility on boreal forest shifts in case the climate also improves in a way. And that's, of course, highly relevant just a few days after COP because we are very much in an overshooting situation. And that's now where the second question from Neboya Nakicinovic comes in. So what do you think? How long after an overshoot is there time until either the tipping continues or whether it comes back quickly? So maybe first in general on the reversibility of what you've seen. I mean, you have those 20, 30 years of satellite data, and maybe you have some evidence from longer sources as well, from longer data records. But then, so what's first? Let's say the theory about the reversibility of such a shift. Yeah, I think from your tree cover diagrams, in theory, there's also a reversibility. But how would it work, and how does it? Maybe you have some more insights on that because it needs then to go also back. And then related to that, if we are now overshooting and what is there a kind of a policy message maybe in that, in a sense that, okay, actually our boreal forests, they can only take that much of overshooting, and then no matter what happens at the global level, they are sort of in a runaway feedback or something like this. So yeah, again, I think it was posed to both of you. I don't know if you have any preference to start. We could go with Ronnie since we always do it back to back then.
Yeah, I can respond to that. So first, I mean, the first thing I'd like to point out is that the study or the modeling study, the projection of tree cover to 2100 means that this mismatch that we see between these sort of forest states, right, the states that we observe today or over the past 20, 25 years, and those that we projected and would expect from the observed tree cover changes that we see, that mismatch is sort of an indication for an instability, which means that what we call borrowed time. It's sort of a concept that describes that we have evidence that for such instability, but it doesn't mean that change is going to happen tomorrow. We don't even know whether it's really going to happen very quickly. I mean, based on our projections, we see quite considerable changes, but we also look at a time scale of 100 years, and so that's just to say that there's already sort of a room for or a time period for response. In terms of reversibility, whether these processes can be reversed once they happen, I mean, this is really something we haven't tested or yeah. I struggle a bit to respond to that. To me, these processes of dieback in the south and reversibility, even if this was reversed in terms of the climatic conditions, that sort of recovery of those forests that have been affected by dieback would very likely be much, much slower than the dieback that actually happened. So yeah, and I think it's hard to anticipate what happens in that sort of time in between, right, during this recovery process. I find this difficult, so I'm not entirely sure whether it would really be reversible or not.
Thanks. You want to add, Ayla?
Sure, I'll come in. So I think the question of reversibility, in a sense, depends a little bit on what we're talking about. So I think Ronnie's did a nice job of demonstrating how you could have a tree cover that could go back to a previous state. But the point he was just making about how the tree species might be different. And so then maybe that's not a full reversal. And I'm also going to evoke one of the other questions here, which is thinking about paleo data and thinking about what was tree line doing in the past. So we the tree line has, for example, in the Canadian Arctic, there's a nice map behind Ronnie there, so we can look at that. You know, it went all the way up to the Arctic coast. Previously in the Holocene, and also with the shrubs. Shrubs were much more abundant within these high latitude systems about 7,000-ish years ago, and there was a lot more fire in those systems based on charcoal records as well. So we don't have a very precise knowledge of what the system looked like, but when it was warmer in the past, the tree line was further north, there were more shrubs, there was more fire. So that is the expectation I think we should have. Of course, the rates of change are different. So that's where it starts to get more unpredictable. So we're seeing much more rapid change of the climate, of the fire system, and yet trees have a limitation on how quickly they can respond, and shrubs to a certain extent as well. So making those predictions of how a forest will respond. If you think about the forest fire feedback loop, so if you take a particular location within the boreal forest and a fire goes through, it's going to take, say that's a black spruce forest, it's going to take 200 years to get back to the previous state or something along those lines. So that sort of limits your reversibility for that one location. And then if you think about the forest community shifting from, say, black spruce to I don't know, deciduous dominated aspen forest or something along those lines, that might take multiple fire cycles to fully progress through. So we're getting closer to more like 1,000 years to make that state change. And within that 1,000 years, all sorts of things could be happening to the climate. So I think it's quite tricky in the current day, even though we have a lot of knowledge of how things were in the past, to make a very concrete prediction of where these systems are going and how those feedbacks are going to influence, for example, carbon storage within soils, which has that really strong global climate implication. So I'll kind of leave it there, but we might touch on some of those topics in future questions.
Maybe in addition to that, I think the lack of evidence, at least that we have in based on our studies, may not necessarily mean that, you know, we're not going to see a northern expansion of forests at all. I mean, as Victor, as you point out quite rightly, I think this can take really long times. That's one thing. But the other one is that because we use satellite data, it may also mean that some of that expansion is already happening, but is just not observable yet, at least not with the data sets that we used. Because we use a data set that looks at tree cover from trees, I think above 5 meters height. So if you think about the far northern reaches, and I've been to some of these places, 5 meters is a lot. That would be giants in that area. So it's very rare that we find these heights. So everything below that is not part of this data set. So we may actually miss some of that expansion that is sort of already happening. However, from fieldwork and the review of several fieldwork studies, and there's lots of review papers on this out there, most of the time, the conclusion is that about 50% of fieldwork sites show an expansion of forests into tundra. So it means that yes, something is happening, but it also means that in 50% of the places we don't see that yet. Yeah.
And just maybe to connect, as far as I would hypothesize, this the shrubification that Ayla, you are observing. I mean, in my limited understanding, that's kind of maybe the first step of also what might follow then. So the trees may just need more time, or they may need a shrub cover to establish themselves underneath and then come up with their competitive advantages or things like this that then actually take over. And so what you don't see in the satellite, you may already see in Ayla's, let's say, plot-based work, even though it's not trees yet, but getting there.
Yeah, I agree with that. And Ronnie, I'll ask you. I think a key thing to think about, which sort of echoes what Ronnie's talking about, is that their recruitment in these systems is really important. So if you want to have a tree line or a shrub line moving north, as in those species moving into new systems, you need to have new recruitment of species. But when the species are already present, which is often the case with the shrubification signal, those individuals just have to grow bigger. And so that's a process that can happen over years to decades and can happen quite quickly. The movement of individuals into a system, that takes longer. So part of it is the tree line advance signal does require that new recruitment. But the recruitment could be happening because a baby tree will only be a few centimeters tall or whatever in its first year or two of growth, and then it will take decades for it to reach a meter or two at tree line, and it will take centuries, or it may never get to 5 meters. So yeah, it's very difficult for us to detect those kind of vegetation changes from space, but that's where the plot level or site level studies come in. So I think we are building a stronger picture, but the recruitment is another key process. So I'll pass to Ronnie.
There's a really interesting study by Roman Dial and colleagues from Alaska where they detected expansion of boreal forests far beyond the tree line in northern Alaska. I think I have to look it up, but I think it was about 40 kilometers north of the tree line. So a huge distance where they found sort of pockets and small groups of young trees that have established in these areas, and they only found them because they looked at winter at aerial images from winter snow cover, and they detected these sort of the shadows of the tree trunks that were sort of sticking out from the snow, and they went to these places and sort of tried to figure out under what conditions these trees grew, and they found that there's sort of a really narrow set of conditions that have to be met for these trees to start to establish themselves there. But they also found that it seems that once there's some establishment going on, there seems to be some sort of facilitation effect. So sort of you have little groups, and once you have these groups, it is easier for others to colonize and to survive in these harsh conditions. So perhaps there's some form of threshold, perhaps that once you reach that threshold of certain numbers of young trees or whatever, or certain sizes, that then you have sort of a more rapid expansion. But still, they were very localized. I mean, it's we're not talking about large areas here.
Okay, thanks. We have a few questions left. I think the one on the pace of the shifts we have discussed a lot. So the one by Daniel Verduren, I think the pace and whether it's relevant for other species we have discussed to quite an extent. We can maybe come back, or if you want to say anything on top, Ronnie and Ayla, you are most welcome to do that. But I would like to turn your attention to two other questions, which are not really related, but maybe a little bit. So there is the one from Tim Cutler on the weakening of AMOC and how maybe this is interacting. And well, there's some research on actually the interconnectedness of tipping elements and how they affect each other. So I just know that this exists. I don't know what really comes out, but maybe you have some idea. And this relates, I think, to the question by Shachar, whether the dynamics in the vegetation change are more affected by summer temperatures or winter temperatures, and which one matters maybe more. Maybe that's, let's say, the more practical entry point that will then give us some hints about the bigger questions about AMOC above. But somehow I think those are related. So again, I give the floor to both of you, and just to the audience. So thanks for staying. There are still more than 50 people here. So this is your last chance to raise a question, because after the reply on those two, we will, shortly, we will come to a close of the session. So please make sure you post your question if you have an urgent one still in the Q&A part. And now I hand over back to you two.
So maybe I will tackle the question about summer and winter temperatures, because I think it moves nicely on from what Ronnie was just talking about with these tree islands. So one of the reasons why a tree island might be a positive feedback for a further recruitment is because once you get a canopy in a tundra system, then the snow melt or snow depth can accumulate because the canopy traps snow in winter, and that snow layer helps to insulate the soils below from the really cold air temperatures, and it facilitates the persistence of new recruits in that system. So that applies to both shrubs and trees, and also from shrubs protecting tree seedlings as well. So those kind of feedbacks between snow and temperature are really important when we think about recruitment in these systems. And so to answer Shakar's question about in the case of recruitment, I would argue that winter temperatures and snow depth are the really critical factors. However, drought conditions in summer are also critical factors. So basically, it's the things that can kill a baby tree that are going to be the big deal there from a recruitment perspective. But when it comes to growth, all these northern species can really shut down their growth in the winter. And so they're not that influenced by cold temperatures, though they do love to be within a snowpack if we're thinking about shrubs and the smaller species within these ecosystems. So warmer over winter might be better, but I think the summer conditions are really what's controlling growth. And we have lots of evidence of that from tree ring studies and the like, and also modeling studies, et cetera. So it's neither one nor the other, the winter or the summer, that wins out. They're both important for different processes that are going on. And when we think through to changes in the global climate system, I think there is the potential for temperatures to get cooler again. But some of these shifts, like if we have new trees recruited into these systems, they're not that limited by cold temperatures per se. So those trees will keep growing. And in some ways, maybe they can grow at a faster rate if it reduces the drought limitations on those species as well, or those individuals. So if the climate warming slows down, it doesn't mean that some of these processes won't continue at pace. So that's my sort of ecological perspective, and I'll pass it over to Ronnie for further thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, there was already a very extensive answer, but maybe one thing to add about temperature and the effect of summer versus winter temperature. Winter temperature also plays a big role in determining some disturbance types. We've seen this in the far northern reaches of Norway, where forests over there are basically dominated to a large extent by mountain birch. And in these forest systems, we have a natural process of cycles of moth larvae that in the springtime start to hatch from the eggs, and they start feeding on these young leaves. And with climate change, what we see is now that new species of moths have entered these northern reaches of the forests because of climate change. And they have led to a more intense herbivory over this sort of early growing season, but also a sort of shortening of these cycles. So a lot more pressure of these larvae on these forests, and the reason for why these larvae could let's say can persist in such large numbers is because the winter temperatures are now often above the threshold that is necessary for large egg mortality in these moths. So it would have to be temperatures, I think, of below minus 30 degrees Celsius. And in the last 20 years, there were rare incidences only where temperatures dropped that low. And that meant that a lot more eggs survived and a lot more larvae were able to hatch. And the result of that were absolutely impressive in a negative sense. When we went there was some of these forests. I mean, no matter where you look to the horizon, to these, on the hilltops, we're talking 90 to 100% tree mortality after these larvae, come through these areas. So a significant, pressure on forests in these parts, mainly as a result of winter temperatures.
Okay, thanks a lot for, sorry, yeah,
Right.
we have to wrap it up, but please, yes, very quickly,
Very
Ayla.
briefly, there was our responses were both very focused on the forest itself, but I think another important point to just briefly make is permafrost thaw. Once you lose the ground ice, that's not really reversible. Some of the forest fire effects, if we have a large area burned, it's going to take a long time for the forest to come back. So maybe some of the biological elements might be semi reversible if you want to look at it that way, but some of the other changes in these systems are not on short timescales.
Yeah, no, that's actually very interesting and very good because it has, I think, shown us in a very nice way this whole seminar how again climate and vegetation and then more complicated soils and so on are connected, and that there's really a lot of change ongoing. There's also different ways to assess this. Very nice examples. Thanks again from both remote sensing and also plot-based work. So please, to the whole audience, thanks for staying, and please give a last round of applause for the two speakers. Make sure you read their papers and cite them, of course, now that you know so much about it. Yeah, this is also very important. There should be more webinars announced in this sort of whole group here. And yeah, Caroline already posted the link to the slides and the recordings, or where you can access those as soon as they are available. So thanks a lot, everybody. We took one more minute, but I think it was worth it. So thanks again for all of you to join, and especially for the speakers to give the presentation, for the nice questions, and then see you at the next webinar.